the previous sessions, we're talking about the fact that all the evidence a creationist or evolutionist, Christian or non-Christian has is the same. Is that right? We all have the same evidence, the same facts. So the fight's not about facts. The battle's really over how you interpret facts, which depends upon what? The starting point you have, the belief system you have to start with. And so I've been illustrating to you that if you start with the Bible's history, put on your biblical glasses, your way of explaining the evidence, and then you go to the evidence of the present and interpret it, that observational science in biology, geology, chemistry and so on actually confirms the Bible's history. But observational science does not confirm your interpretation based upon evolutionary ideas or the beliefs that man has concerning the past. And in the last session, we specifically used the example of chemistry, biochemistry, talking about DNA, that observational science actually confirms in the beginning God created, when you use the science of information, talking about chemistry, biochemistry, but does not confirm in the beginning hydrogen. In other words, as a Christian, we had a logical, reasoned defense of our faith, showing that we could confirm the Bible's history. You can't scientifically prove it ultimately, there's that faith aspect, but nonetheless we could use science to confirm the Bible's history. And if the Bible's history is true, we're saying the rest of it is true. Now what we're going to do in this session is use a different example. We're going to go to biology. We're going to use observational science in biology, and we're going to concentrate on dogs and changes in dogs. You often find in public school textbooks, I know when I was a public school teacher, dogs are used as an example to talk about Darwinian evolution, that Darwin saw changes in animals such as dogs, and so he looked at those changes and said, these changes represent the changes that add up to big changes to enable one kind to change into another. In fact, in the British Museum of Natural History, as I'll show you in a moment, dogs are used as one of the examples of evidence that Darwinian evolution has to be true. And so I wanted to discuss that. And the question we're asking here is, do animals change? Because when you look at dogs, you do see that dogs change. But are those changes really representative of changes that add up ultimately to big changes, such as changing dogs into something else? In other words, one kind into a totally different kind. Well, that's what we're going to look at here. Because if you believe in evolution, I mean Darwinian evolution, molecules to man evolution is what I'm talking about, then over millions of years, one kind changes into a totally different kind. Remember from the last session, you get new information added into the genes so that you have characteristics that never previously existed, so you can get something totally different. And this happens supposedly over millions of years. Now, when you read the Bible, it says that God created distinct kinds of animals and plants to reproduce after their own kind. In fact, you find that phrase 10 times in Genesis chapter 1. And what we want to do here is to use observational science to test this particular idea that life evolved over millions of years, molecules to man, one kind into another, or this, that God created distinct kinds to reproduce after their own kind. And again, we need to be reminded of our Bible verse, 1 Peter 3:15, where it says we always need to be prepared to give an answer. So if someone says to you, wait a minute, dogs change, cats change, that's what Darwin saw, this is all evidence of evolution, because that's what they're taught in the public school system through the secular universities and colleges and so on, what's your answer going to be as we look and discuss this dog kind? So let's apply observational science to the dog kind. Now, as you do look at dogs, you find there are lots of different sorts of dogs. There are different species of dogs, all these wild dogs that you see here. And you see there are many differences among those. What does the secular world say about that? Well, it's very interesting. In a secular evolutionist journal in recent times, they made this statement. They said, the origin of the domestic dogs from wolves has been established, suggesting a common origin from a single gene pool for all dog populations. In other words, according to this secular source, all dogs share a common gene pool. If they all share a common gene pool, they're all related, and they're all closely related to each other, which means they're all one kind, which means there's only one kind of dog. Okay, and this is from a secular source. And they're saying domestic dogs originated from wolves. And I suggest to you that the original dog looked more like maybe a wolf, something like that, as you can see there. Now, as you go on in that article, it actually says 2 kilogram teacup poodles, as well as your greyhounds and so on, says they all come from the same stock. Only subtle differences distinguish dogs from coyotes, jackals, etc. So, therefore, even creatures like that. Hard to imagine that that is related to a wolf. Almost seems impossible, doesn't it? But according to this secular source, all dogs, including poodles and wolves, are all related. Now, people often say, wait a minute, how could that be? Look at all these different species here. In fact, some people say, isn't that evolution? And then you have all your domestic varieties of dogs as well, not just poodles, but there are many other sorts. Now, remember, evolution in the molecules to man sense You start with no information, no code system. Matter produces a code system. Matter produces information, and over millions of years you get new information added in, and your pools of information keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. What I want to show you is that when you understand real observational science, when we look at genetics, you look at natural selection, adaptation, what you find is you lose the pools of information, if you like. In other words, a pool of information actually decreases over time. It doesn't increase, the opposite of the molecules to man process. In fact, it decreases so much you finally get to the point where there's not that much information left, as you can see represented by the poodle there, which is basically the end of line in dogs, by the way. Because once you get beyond a poodle, well, I call a poodle almost not a dog. Because that's sort of the end there when it comes to dogs. But I won't explain it to you. I don't want to pick on poodles too much, but I won't explain it all to you. Now, when I was over in London at the British Museum of Natural History, I mean, it's a beautiful, beautiful building. You go over there to London. If anyone's got the evidence that Darwinian evolution is true, wouldn't you expect it to be the people in London? I mean, that's Darwin's home territory right there. You'd expect the British Museum of Natural History, said to be one of the leading museums in the world. If anyone's got the evidence for Darwinian evolution, they would have so there. And when you go into the museum, you go up onto the second floor, they have an entire section, it's a large section, all devoted to teaching you Darwinian evolution. And as you walk in, of course, the big sign says The Origin of Species. Of course, Darwin's book in 1859, the first part of the title was called The Origin of Species. And then you walk past the bust of Darwin there, and you walk into this big exhibit room. And as they lead you in, they have two signs. And I want to read those signs to you, because what I want to show you is how people in the world today are indoctrinated, how they're brainwashed. What they do here in the British Museum of Natural History is actually done in public school textbooks and secular textbooks throughout the world. They set up a straw man. They try to make Christians look like they don't believe in science, and they set this straw man up, and then they demolish it. And what they're doing as they do this, they actually use the word evolution in two different ways, which most people don't understand and most people don't grasp. And they're really saying, because animals change, evolution is happening, and they use the word evolution for animals like dogs changing. And then they say, because evolution is true, dogs change, therefore evolution, molecules to man, is true. And that's really how students are taught in the secular education system throughout the world. I know in public school textbooks in America, same in Australia, that's basically how they're taught. Students are taught, see, evolution's true, animals change. See, evolution's true, molecules to man. And I want to go through and show you what they do here. If you can understand this, you'll grasp hold of why so many people today think that you have to believe in evolution from a biological perspective. Here's the first sign. The first sign says this: before Charles Darwin, most people believed that God created all living things in exactly the form that we see them today. This is the basis of the doctrine of creation. Stop there for a moment. Do creationists believe that? Do we believe that God created everything exactly as we see it today? No, not at all. For instance, take poodles, right? Poodles are really degenerate mutant mutts, okay? They're full of mistakes, they have all sorts of mutations, they have problems. If any of you have one of those purebred dogs, you'll know that you've got to take them to the vet and give them all sorts of medicines, and you spend millions of dollars to keep them alive. I know we have a dog like that. It's not a poodle, may as well be, but anyway. It's a white little fluffy thing. But when God finished creating at the end of the sixth day, he said everything he made was very good. How could he have made a poodle at that stage? Because you can't call a poodle very good, right? It's a degenerate mutant. So you see, in that sense, God didn't make poodles. Now, he made the original dog, but poodles, actually a domestic variety of dog, what do you call a purebred, if you like, we'll discuss that in a little while, and they have actually been formed since that time. See, when you look around the world today, you know, there's one event in history alone that would dictate against God creating everything in the form we see it, in the place we see it today. What would that be? The flood of Noah's day. Because if there was a global flood, it would kill off all the land animals, only those that were on Noah's Ark would survive. So how could, you know, God have created all living things exactly in the form that we see them today, where we find them? In fact, Darwin was taught that by the theologians that taught him. He did a theology degree, never did a science degree. And when Darwin heard some of these things, that God created animals and plants just where we see them today, he did some experiments to show that animals migrate and there are differences in animals from mainland to island and things like that. And he was trying to show that this is not true. But see, what they're doing here is setting up a straw man. What they're trying to say is, creationists believe God made the animals and plants just as we see them today, but then they're going to go through and show you, but in real science, observational science, we see animals change, therefore creationists are wrong, they don't believe in science, therefore evolution's true. You see what they're doing? They're setting up this straw man deliberately to undermine creationists and to try to bolster the idea of evolution. And so they're saying this is the basis of the doctrine of creation. Incidentally, when God made everything too, it was very good. There wasn't any death in the world. Everything was perfect. There were no mutations. There was no disease or suffering or anything like that. Incidentally, did you know that even in our churches and Sunday schools, many people actually teach children exactly what this sign says? You think about it. How many times in Sunday school literature do you see an example that God created, and you try and teach children this example from design, and usually a design feature goes like this. Look how God beautifully created this little creature and designed this little creature to rip the insides out of this one. You see what I mean? God did not design it that way in the first place, because originally it didn't rip the insides out of this one. Originally all the animals were vegetarian, according to Genesis chapter 1, verse 30. And so they weren't violent or anything like that. God didn't even put the fear of man into the animals until after the flood. So here they're setting up this straw man, and then the next sign says this. But Darwin's work supported the view that all living things have developed into the forms we see today by a process of gradual change over very long periods of time. This is what is meant by evolution. Now, do you see what they're doing? Creationists believe God created the animals and plants just as we see them today, but evolutionists, Darwin, believe that animals change, and you go out and you have a look, animals change, therefore evolution's true.